On Sunday, October 21st, the President has still not made up his mind of whether he's going to use a blockade or airstrikes. And Bobby Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell, as you can tell by the movie, were a little surprised at that. They had thought he'd made his decision to go with the naval blockade. However, when he asked to meet with General LeMay again to talk about the scenarios of airstrikes, they're wondering which route he's going to take. Now, General LeMay, if you remember, brings General Walter Sweeney with him to the meeting. There's lots of others. Maxwell Taylor's there. You know, several members of the military are there. And the President asked General Sweeney if airstrikes would guarantee 100% destruction of the missiles and missile sites in Cuba. And his answer was, what, Aaron?
Yes, but only
He said, yes, I can guarantee we can destroy 100% of the sites or missiles that we know about. And then General LeMay stepped in, Nick, and he guaranteed what? Over 90% of the missiles. So the point of that is Kennedy's still thinking about what direction he's going to take. He then informs military leaders that he will brief Congress at 5 o'clock on Monday night. He will give his speech at 7 p.m. and he asked General Maxwell Taylor to put all United States Armed Forces on DEFCON 3 at 7 o'clock Monday night, which would be an increase in force readiness above normal readiness. Okay? And that takes us to Monday, October 22nd, and the events of that day. Kind of interesting, early that morning, on Monday morning, October 22nd of 1962, President Kennedy telephones 3 former presidents of the United States to brief them or let them know what's going on with Cuba. So they become in the know before anyone else gets to hear about this. And he calls President Herbert Hoover, he calls President Harry Truman, and he calls President Dwight Eisenhower. And not only does he inform them about the situation in Cuba, what do you think else he might be doing? Nobody knows for sure because the conversations aren't public, but what do you think they might have been talking about? Some advice, yeah, getting some advice on what should be done. But he does contact 3 former presidents, Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower, to brief him on the situation. And then he sits down and writes a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. And then he sits down and writes a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev.
Is that like an ultimatum?
No, it's just basically a letter or a communication between the two. Now here's what he says in the correspondence. You do not have to write it down, just listen and try to determine what he means. He said, quote, I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a war which it is crystal clear no country could win, and which could only result in catastrophic consequences for the whole world. So he's basically asking Khrushchev, are you really doing this? I can't believe in a nuclear age that you would put the world in danger by putting us in position for a war that no one can win. And not only that, the ramifications of this will be catastrophic for all citizens of the entire world. At that time, Pierre Salinger announces to the press that President Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a subject of the highest national security. Does he tell them about Cuba specifically? No. Now what's unusual about this headline on this Goldsboro News in Carolina? It says, Kennedy will address nation tonight on subject of highest national urgency. What's this tell you? It's the morning paper. They ran 2 editions of major newspapers in these days. A morning edition and a night edition. And this was the morning edition. This is what people woke up to, went to the newsstands and picked up and thought, oh my goodness, the President's going to speak tonight on national television about something that has the highest national urgency. But he does not explain publicly what that is. Okay? Now, prior to his speech that evening, he makes the following initial preparations. These are 4 things he does prior to the speech. And these 4 things are going to tell you what choice is going to be made that evening. Okay? So prior to his speech that evening, President Kennedy made the following 4 preparations. 1, he ordered the United States Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. He ordered the United States Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. Now, if you're the Navy and you get the word that you need to begin preparations for a blockade of Cuba, what might be your first question?
Why?
Not so much why. Usually military doesn't ask why. Where? In other words, that'll lead to number 2. And what Kennedy does is he basically draws a line in the sand, so to speak. He actually draws a line in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic Ocean, stating how far he will allow these Soviet merchant ships to go. Okay? So he draws a line in the sand, basically, on how far he's going to let Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before the United States will take action. So he picks a line in the sea, basically. This is the quarantine line when we enact it. Has he enacted it yet? No, it's still being talked about. But he's preparing so then when he does, he doesn't have to waste time getting the military where they need to be or know what they need to know. Third thing he does is he informs these military personnel that if these merchant ships cross this imaginary point and they enter American waters, the merchant ships will be attacked by American vessels. So he announces to the military that if any of these merchant ships cross this imaginary line, this point, and they enter American waters, the merchant ships will be attacked. And the fourth thing he makes pretty clear to the military is that the Soviet Union ignores this quarantine line, that the United States of America will declare war on the Soviet Union. Okay, so he's serious here, okay? He is serious. His initial preparations, ordering the Navy to begin preparations for a blockade of Cuba, drawing basically a line in the sand on how far he's going to let Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before we take any action. He then informs the military that if the merchant ships cross the point and they enter American waters, they will be attacked. And he also makes it clear that if the Soviet Union ignores this quarantine line, we're going to have a war declared between the United States and Soviet Union. Those are initial preparations so the military knows what to do. Now, once the line is in place officially, they may have a little tweaking to that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay? So, what does he do at 5 o'clock that evening? What? No, not at 5. He briefs congressional leaders on the situation in Cuba and his plan to enact a quarantine line. So at 5 p.m., President Kennedy meets with congressional leaders. He outlines what's going on in Cuba and what his plan is concerning the blockade. In the meantime, while he's meeting with congressional leaders, at 6 o'clock, Secretary of State Dean Rusk notifies Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin of the contents of the President's speech that he will give at 7. So as President Kennedy is briefing congressional leaders on the situation in Cuba and the blockade, Secretary of State Dean Rusk is meeting with Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, and he's revealing to Dobrynin the contents of the President's speech. So when is Russia going to find out that we know about the missiles and that we're going to blockade Cuba? 6 o'clock that night. They're going to know a little bit earlier than the American people. Now, you remember Andrei Gromyko, who President Kennedy met with, that denied? In the meeting and on the movie, I didn't point him out, Anatoly Dobrynin was there. He was the the Russian ambassador to the United States. Gromyko was simply an American diplomat, okay? So who has more pull? The ambassador or the diplomat? The ambassador, without question, okay? So Dean Rusk tells him about the speech at 6. Now, we move back. When Kennedy leaves his meeting with congressional leaders, he is very upset and angry. Why? Why is Kennedy upset and angry after his meeting with congressional leaders?
Question his power.
They don't, well, not his power, but they don't support him. I don't know if they agree, but they don't support him. He isn't getting the support of the congressional leaders. I'm not sure if they didn't like his plan or didn't like the whole thing. But he did not get support from congressional leaders, and he was angry and upset and frustrated. And what's he about to do? Give a speech. And I found out a long time ago in my life that you never want to say things when you're angry, because I've given a lot of great speeches to students and teachers and parents and administrators that I lived to regret. They were great speeches and probably were correct in what I said, but because I was angry, the way I said them didn't go over very well PR-wise. And so somebody has got to get the president settled down after his meeting with congressional leaders before he goes and speaks to the American people. And who's that going to be? Not Bobby.
His dad.
Kenneth O'Donnell. Kenneth O'Donnell, because he's with him. And he can see that the president is very upset, and he knows that he has to settle the president down before his national television speech, because it's a very important speech, right? And he doesn't want to have him give the speech while he's angry. So as the president's picking up his stuff and getting ready to go out to give his speech, Kenneth O'Donnell says, I need a word. I need a word. What does that mean? I need to talk to you about something. I need a word. And President Kennedy says to him, listen, I've got time to give you a word here. I've got to go talk to the American people. And O'Donnell's comment back to him fairly sharply was, you're the President of the United States. They will wait for you. In other words, I need a word. And do you think John Kennedy knew what he was trying to do? Well, sure he did, but he was mad. And Kenneth O'Donnell didn't want to see him go on national television mad, so he says, I need a word. He said, I don't have time for a word. I got to give this speech. He said, you're the President of the United States. They will wait for you. Okay? So what Kenneth O'Donnell does is he massages the president's ego, okay, settles him down, settles down his emotion, tries to get his frustration under control, visits about things that, you know, maybe don't have a lot to do with the crisis, gets him settled down, and he sends him out to the Oval Office to give the speech. Okay? Very good move, because I'm not sure how it would come out otherwise. Well, at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on October 22nd of 1962, President John F. Kennedy addresses the nation about the crisis in Cuba. And I'm going to give you 8 things that he emphasizes. 8 things that he emphasizes. Now, you're going to get a chance to see the speech here in just a few minutes, and what I want you to do is write down these 8 things, and then when you watch the speech, kind of point out when he talks about each one. Because he's going to talk about more than this, but I want you to hit these 8 things. What's the first thing he is going to tell the American people? No, that's not yet. What's planned? They don't even know what the plan's for. He's going to tell them there are ballistic missiles in Cuba, and he's going to tell them there's 2 different types. There's shorter range ones that have about 1,000-mile radius, and they have some that are more. And he's going to explain that. Some were 1,000, some were 2,000. Different missiles. What else is he going to tell them about? How these missiles are going to get launched. They're going to tell them, he's going to tell them about the missile launching pads that are under construction, that are Soviet soldiers that are constructing these launching pads that are going to be able to send these missiles off. So he tells them about the missiles already on the ground, the types, what their capabilities are, and he tells them that there are missile construction pads being constructed by Soviet personnel. What else might he tell them that the Soviet Union's doing or not doing? Admitting that there are any missiles or missile launching pads in Cuba. He makes it clear that the Soviet Union are denying that, and he's going to give a couple of examples, including the Gromyko Conference, that shows the American people that the Soviets are indeed denying this. And then what would he tell them about? Somebody already mentioned. No. His idea, he's going to enact a naval blockade. He's going to tell the people about the naval blockade. And what might the people want to know after that? what's going to happen if things go south. And this is basically the fifth thing. Kennedy explains to the American people what's going to happen if the Soviet Union or Cuba decide to launch missiles against not only the United States, but any other country in the Western Hemisphere. Because when you look at the missile situation, you know, here's the missiles. They just don't shoot one way at 1,000 yards. They have the ability to shoot in a circle pattern. So there's lots of people at risk. All of them in the Western Hemisphere are allies. And this is what he says, quote, you don't have to write it down, but he says, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." So what's he saying? They launch missiles against anyone in the Western Hemisphere, what are we going to do? We're going to declare war and launch missiles against the Soviet Union. So it's pretty serious. That's the fifth thing. Now the sixth thing he does is he assures the American people that he's going to get the approval of an organization called the Organization of American States. And what that is, it's kind of a mini United Nations that's located in Washington, D.C. And those are mainly countries that belong to what? The Western Hemisphere. Whereas the United Nations is countries that involve everyone, okay? So the sixth thing is he tells the American people that he plans to get full support of the Organization of American States, or he refers to it as the OAS, Organization of American States. And what we have to do here is nobody knows what's going on. So we have to get the approval of people like the Organization of American States that we are doing the right thing, that we're just not picking on this little country. Okay? The next thing he emphasizes, number 7, is that we have to have a special meeting of the United Nations Security Council so we can get support from them for our actions. Right? So we're not only going to get support from the Organization of American States, but then we're going to have a special meeting of the United Nations Security Council and get the United Nations support as well. Now, how are we going to get this support from the United Nations? We could probably talk the Organization of American States, although that won't be easy. They've never had a unanimous vote on anything, ever. But how are we going to convince the United Nations that what we're doing is right? Yeah, what's that evidence going to be? Pictures of the missiles and missile launching pads. We're going to go to the United Nations and try to get the Soviet Union to finally admit to what they're doing in front of everybody else. And we'll see if that happens or not. That's a whole nother topic. And finally, the last thing Kennedy does, which I think is pretty interesting, is he gives a specific time to his speech to talk directly to the people of Cuba, emphasizing to the people of Cuba, you know, I know you're in an oppressed situation there, and please be known that you're the only Latin American country in the world that has nuclear weapons in your country, and these nuclear weapons are not doing you people any good. Your leader is using you. He basically criticizes Castro and tries to appeal to the Cuban people, who they are broadcasting this to, that this is a bad deal for you. Then he ends his speech by telling Americans how much the United States wants peace, but yet we can't tolerate these types of things, and then ends it. It's about a 20-minute speech. I want to show it to you right now, and I really want you to concentrate on the things we've talked about and see when indeed he states these things in this particular speech. Okay? So that's what we're doing. So just kind of go through those notes and try to pick out when he talks about it. Okay, here we go. I don't care about this first part here, so.
To the next.
Here we go.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail.
Now what he's talking about there is the initial flight, right, that showed the missiles, and then the second flight that pinpointed as many as 40, right? So he's basically telling them we've had two reconnaissance missions, and now we got to do something about it.
The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles, capable of traveling more than twice as far, and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as